Street Fighter Alpha 3 is the most content-rich Street Fighter game I've played for the channel this year. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and today, it's time to finish my series of Street Fighter Alpha videos with my review of Alpha 3. Unlike the SF2 series of games, the Alpha trilogy is quite unique within the arcade updating business model of Capcom and other fighting game developers from the 90s because each subsequent title is incredibly different mechanically than what came before, and this effect is most clear with Alpha 3. From the jump, the changes in the graphic design of Alpha 3 is stark in comparison to the first two games, and it's clear the culture of the West in the 90s began to permeate this series in a way that would further envelop the 3 trilogy of games. There's loads of Alpha 3's aspects, including its shift in storytelling and new characters, that lead me to feel that this is another masterpiece tier fighting game from the Capcom of yesteryear, and by the end of this video, I'll explain why its design is timeless in its quality. Beyond the expanded roster, the other major mechanical change between Alpha 3 and its predecessors is the isms mechanic, which right from the jump reminded me quite a lot of the variation mechanic in Mortal Kombat X, where each character has 3 different ways in which to be played. Each ism, A, X, or V, changes which mechanics the character has access to, which is the major difference between variations in MKX and this system in Alpha 3. In MKX, the variation mechanic determines which extra specials and combo strings a character will have access to, and this is more or less the consistent change across all 100 variations in the game. Alpha 3's consistency of ism design comes with which mechanics are tied to each ism type. It makes most sense to me to break down each of these one at a time, so let's jump right in with a look at A-ism first. Whenever I play arcade-era games, I keep track of how much money the game would have cost me to play back in the day, and for Alpha 3, I'm approaching this slightly differently than in my previous Street Fighter videos. I recorded how much I would have spent with each ism separately, and in terms of A-ism, I spent 26 metaphorical dollary dues, which is the equivalent of $51.68 today. Normally, a high cost for this sort of analysis speaks to the overall difficulty of an arcade game, but that's not necessarily the case in this regard. Alpha 3 is more difficult than the other Alpha games in my opinion, but this cost is definitely more the product of the inflated roster than anything else. A-ism is the default ism for each and every character. I think the designers chose to do this primarily because it allows the player to have access to every Alpha specific mechanic, such as air blocking and Alpha counters, in addition to a myriad of different supers. In this way, A-ism is the Alpha centric variation, encompassing everything new, unique, and fresh about the Alpha trilogy over what came before, while also nixing some of the more complex things introduced in Alpha 2, such as the custom combo mechanic, something we'll talk about more later on in this video. In this way, A-ism exemplifies a combination of classic Street Fighter design with the Alpha improvements, stripping away elements of gameplay design and putting them in different isms. It's for this reason that I can actually comprehend why someone may like Alpha 2 more than 3. I myself enjoy both games fairly close to even, but someone who wants to experience the full depth of a game's mechanics in one character isn't likely to enjoy the way Alpha 3 cuts up its mechanics into 3 distinct packages. That's a limitation that's bound to be incompatible with the legacy skills some players had coming out of SF2 and the first 2 Alpha games back in the day. However, that doesn't match my impression of these sorts of limiters in video games. Perhaps because of how I'm a truly eclectic gamer, valuing variety quite highly, the limitation of available gameplay mechanics, of restrictions being placed upon the player, can truly add to the overall design of a game. Survival horror as a genre is predicated upon the denial of resources and game mechanics, including such pillars of importance as being able to save progress. Alpha 2 gives the player access to all the game mechanics of that title for each character, and this leads to a lot of depth. However, Alpha 3 restricting tools does not reduce the depth of the game in my opinion. Instead, I would say that Alpha 3's depth comes from the higher volume of unique interactions that now exist between the different variations of potential matches. An A-ism character being paired with an X-ism is going to lead to unique clashes from an A-ism coming to blows against a V-ism. There's dynamics to the gameplay that play into the psychology of fighting games that exploits the chess-like flow state high-level play that these games usually elicit. A-ism is the most full ism, at least in terms of mechanics, but the others have their own idiosyncrasies, and X-ism is perhaps the oddest, quirkiest bird of all. Universally, the X-ism mode denies the player access to air blocking and multiple supers, instead limiting them to one single super combo. To off-balance these restrictions, X-ism gives the player a significantly higher damage per hit buff, albeit this also comes with a major caveat, as the X-ism player will also take more damage too. So what's the point of this mode exactly? Why would anyone want to pick a mode where they give up so much for just a damage boost, regardless of how impressive that boost is? Well, I suspect that the inclusion of the X-ism mode is Capcom's attempt at making the Alpha Trilogy appeal to the SF2 mega fans. The massive shift between Super Turbo and Alpha likely created a schism in the Street Fighter fanbase. As a massive Mortal Kombat fan, I know from experience how much massive changes in gameplay systems can essentially fracture a fandom. It's possible Capcom recognized this over the course of Alpha and Alpha 2's launches, and sought to address this with Alpha 3. X-isms play much more similarly to Super Turbo after all. This is a creative solution for a problem that invariably affects all long-running franchises, but unlike Capcom in the 90s, most game developers either can't or won't even attempt to branch various communities within their franchise's fan bases. Mortal Kombat X kind of did this with the MK series back in 2015, but that's the only other example I can think of off the top of my head. In fact, it's hard for me to separate the way Capcom designed Alpha 3 from MKX. Whether or not MKX's variation mechanic is inspired by Alpha 3, is NRS's way of replicating the stance swapping system in the 3D era games, or is a little bit of both, is borderline impossible to say for sure. I found an article on Event Hub saying that Boone said it was inspired by Alpha 3, but they didn't actually directly quote him saying so, and their source was a Twin Galaxies Twitch stream that I didn't manage to find. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but it's not super important to this specific video. The only reason I even went on this tangent in the first place is because MKX is the only other fighting game I've played to exhibit this style of fighting framework, lending itself to useful comparisons. X-ism exhibiting extreme mechanical differences, from A-ism adds a novelty to the isms mechanic of Alpha 3 that the variation mechanic in MKX doesn't have. Don't get me wrong here, I'm a massive MK fan, it's my second favorite franchise after all, and I do prefer MKX's approach all things considered, but that's more a matter of personal taste and a statement on what I personally look for in fighting games. MKX's variations lend themselves to more interesting combo pathways and experimentation that always leads me to labbing for hours on end, whereas Alpha 3's foundationally changes the way the player interacts with their selected characters, and often led me to enjoying certain isms for each character to the point where I don't really see myself ever wanting to experiment with the others ever again. MKX's approach never caused this effect for me, as I always found myself hitting the lab with all three variations for each character I chose to play. However, me preferring MKX's approach doesn't mean Alpha 3's isn't great in its own right. The loss of mechanics and moves sometimes leads to some interesting combat scenarios, and since I completed the game with each character's ism variation, I was forced to learn how to do certain things I've struggled with in the past. In last week's Alpha 2 video, I talked about how I couldn't figure out how to do Akuma's Shungokusatsu, or Raging Demon, super, because the code for it just looked like gobbledygook to me. However, when I noticed that the only super available to the player with X-ism Akuma is Raging Demon, I hit the lab and forced myself to figure it out. It took me quite a while to puzzle out a solution as to what the move list was trying to tell me to do, but eventually I figured it out, and this is something I probably would never have done if it weren't for the X-ism forcing me to learn. The lack of freedom is sometimes the only thing that allows a player to grow in their skills, and this is a big positive of Alpha 3's design for me. The other major thing I learned how to do was the double 360 input for Zangief's Super SPD. I only managed to do this once, but it still felt good nonetheless. The restriction to one super foundationally shifts the way the player plays the game, and as such, X-ism characters play differently from their A-ism counterparts. Some characters take this even further though, such as Adon, Rolento, and Sodom. Adon and Rolento have completely different jumping mechanics in their X-ism iterations. Adon does a unique jumping flip kick when hitting any attack button in the air, and this leads to some interesting tricks the player can do with him. I found the ability to short hop with this unique skill to be particularly fun, but it's a move that can really keep the opponent guessing since it's something the player can opt in or out of, and because of the way the Adon player gets full control on the exact particulars of how high and far their jump is actually going to go. The The aerial X-ism attack is great for leading to some super fun cross-ups and a complete revocation of the neutral game. Rolento's X-ism comes with a similar style of jumping mechanic. His changes his jump to a super fast and far-reaching one, which adds to his general hit-and-run style of zoning gameplay, leading to a unique zipping back and forth pounce-style gameplay that is fairly reminiscent of Vega in some ways. Sodom gets new weapons in his X-ism, katanas that add a little bit of range to his attacks, allowing him to more effectively poke at his opponents. This combination of elements is what led X-ism into becoming my second favorite ism in the game. In terms of cost, X-ism cost me a stack of $29, which is the equivalent of $57.64 today. Based on this data, this means that I found X and A-isms to be fairly close together in terms of viability. This data is by no means empirical enough to say definitively that that's the way it is, and is definitely impacted primarily because of the way I personally played each character on the roster. And player skill is likely the source of added cost, especially considering my time with V-ism. V-ism is probably the most broken of the three isms. That would be my guess at least, despite my personal experience with the variation itself. V-ism grants the player access to most of the basic alpha mechanics again, like air blocking and alpha counters. However, it denies the player all super combos. Instead, V-ism gives the player the ability to enter into a custom combo mode that is likely based on the one from Alpha 2, although they don't function exactly 100% the same way. In Alpha 3, V-ism has three possible activations: a light, medium, or heavy, which is done by hitting the two attack buttons of the same corresponding strength at the same time. The difference between each is the speed at which the custom combo shadow reiterates the player's actions. So, for example, a light custom combo activation is going to lead to a shadow that imitates the player's actions literally right after they finish the moves themselves, and I found this to be fairly decent at breaking block meters. Alternatively, a heavy activation makes the custom combo shadow attack far later than the player, meaning they can use it to trap the opponent with heavy hitting attacks that cover for the recovery frames of those actions. To balance this, V-ism comes with the lowest damage per hit rate in the game, meaning that if a player can't capitalize on the custom combo nature of V-isms, they are in for a bad time. This is doubly true because of the fact that getting hit once knocks the player out of their custom combo state, essentially making it so that they burned half of their bisected bar for no reasons whatsoever. There's a risk and reward to V-isms in this way that rewards high skill players and punishes those with less. Personally, I don't have the skill to benefit from V-isms. I'll be honest. It's partially because of the fact that I've only been playing Street Fighter for any significant amount of time this year, and that I jump around from character to character, playing literally everyone on the cast. Naturally, this leads me to being not particularly super great with any one fighter. This is likely why my V-ism playthroughs cost me $52 in hypothetical quarters, which is the equivalent to $103.35 in modern money. Yeah, I found finishing the game with V-isms to be nearly twice as difficult as the other variations. This is definitely partly because of the fact that playing against the AI deletes the positives of the variation, leaving only the damage debuff. What I mean is that once a custom combo is activated, the AI will typically immediately respond with whatever exact move is necessary to hit me, ending the V-ism activation before I could do anything. This is definitely a byproduct of Alpha 3's AI's input reading, which is nothing new or unique about this game in comparison to other games in the series. It's just that this aspect of AI is particularly oppressive when in this ism because of how it's such a hard counter to anything the player can do, in my experience anyway. I actually began to dread my V-ism playthroughs for each character because I knew this was going to be a consistent source of consternation for me. Sometimes I would think that I was getting the round-winning blow on an opponent just for the damage debuff to shave off just enough to mistake my estimation. Or I would activate my custom combo with complete confidence that I had the AI in just the right spot, just for them to either counter hit or block through the entire meter. This isn't really an ism problem and is definitely more a consequence of playing against the computer. The trisection of the isms really makes it seem like Alpha 3 is designed to give the player the choice between playing Super Turbo, Alpha, or Alpha 2, which I do think is a design choice that is fun in its essence. It was fun playing through this game and seeing the different interactions that exist between each variation, and intrigue is definitely what led me to rolling the credits multiple times. Story is an interesting oddity in fighting games. Coming from a Mortal Kombat background, it's something that I've personally always really valued, as an MK game with a terrible story is typically worse than those with great ones. It does matter within the context of that franchise, but that's not how it is with other fighting game series. In others, such as Street Fighter, story isn't a big reason why people come to these games, or at least, that's my experience hearing people talk about this series, and within my own comment sections over the past 2 years. The Alpha Trilogy appears to be the exception in this case, as each Alpha game has approached storytelling in unique fashions, and each approach foundationally shifts the way the player engages with the lore, characterization, and plot of Street Fighter II's prequel. As of right now, this feature of Alpha 3 is why it's my favorite game in the series so far, with Alpha 2 being fairly close in my esteem. Alpha 3 does things in terms of the campaignification of the arcade mode that sets it apart from most fighters that I've ever played. Generally speaking, Mortal Kombat is the story and lorehead friendly fighting game series. Historically speaking, it's a series that's only gone strength to strength, high point to high point in terms of its story and lore, with the only real exception being the Hourglass arc from Mortal Kombat 11 and 2023's MK1. Even that travesty, that absolute insult of writing, is still more interesting and better done than 90% of storytelling frameworks in fighting games. Storytelling alongside single-player content are two aspects of fighting game design that rarely get the respect they deserve in my opinion. However, I finally get to add another game to my list of fighting games with interesting story modes. Alpha 3 has a unique campaign for each fighter. Now, these campaigns reuse certain design tropes and moments between different campaigns, but before completing an arcade playthrough, there's no way a player would know how their playthrough is going to go. There are 3 separate tiers to each arcade playthrough. Firstly, each character has a midpoint pre-fight conversation with a character that has a unique relationship with the player's choice. This means that every arcade playthrough with that character is going to have that same fight at that same moment, which means that some characters are more difficult to complete the arcade mode with than others because of the way certain CPU characters are much harder than others. Secondly, each character has a round 9 encounter that is preceded with dialogue too. While the round 5 opponent can definitely change the difficulty of any particular character's arcade mode, the round 9 opponent has way more of an impact. Finally, the player has the last round against Bison, or an additional bonus round preceding him. The campaign always ends with Bison, other than Bison's own campaign, which ends with Ryu. But sometimes the player is given an extra boss fight style round against either Balrog or Junie and Julie. The Balrog fight is just a boss fight, and I know that Balrog is playable in other versions of Alpha 3, but for the version I have access to, which is the 30th Anniversary Collection, he was strictly a boss character. In this game, Balrog does feel like a boss though, instead of the joke that he is in the SF2 series of games. Literally, my favorite thing about Alpha 3 is the 2-on-1 fight of Julie and Junie though. They are Bison's brainwashed assassins, much like how Cammy is story-wise in this game. In fact, Julie and Junie have the same fighting style as Cammy, though they do have unique mechanics. Julie is able to charge her super meter, whereas Junie is able to heal the pair. This being a 2-on-1 fight also introduces some unique oddities to Street Fighter design, as the player can become sandwiched between Julie and Junie, making blocking impossible. As such, it adds an element of crowd and area control to Street Fighter, two mechanics that rarely show up in fighting games at all. These reasons are why this particular fight is literally my favorite thing about Alpha 3, and is something I always looked forward to. The final aspect of Alpha 3's storytelling is how the final fight against Bison works. Unlike every other arcade fighter I've ever played, the player gets one single chance to beat Bison. Losing leads to a universal bad ending, where the player is used as fuel for the Psycho Drive, which is used to wipe out a whole city and presumably leads to Bison's domination of the world. The only exception to this is when the player loses to Ryu as Bison, which instead results in Ryu's good ending. If the player is able to beat Bison, they get a character unique good ending that results in the player's character destroying the Psycho Drive. Once again, the exception is Bison's good ending, which is actually the box standard bad ending. This is most certainly the most lame thing in the game, as even though it makes sense, they could have easily given him a unique ending, perhaps something like taking over Ryu's body, which is something Bison mentions various times throughout his own campaign, and other characters' campaigns. These variable campaigns make playing all characters on the cast enticing and is the thing that pushed me to complete Alpha 3, even when certain AI encounters made me want to put the game down for a few days. I'm not going to belabor this point because everyone knows it's a given that the AI in fighting games cheat. This is just a proven fact, as modern vintage gamer has demonstrated this in regards to Mortal Kombat 2 and the Street Fighter 2 line of games. It's baked into the code that difficulty in 90s arcade fighters is just a how often does the AI cheat slider. However, I need to talk about this with each and every fighter I review for the channel because it's important to keep track of which games handle this aspect of arcade fighter design better than others. Alpha and Alpha 2 were fine in my opinion, better than most others within this franchise and without. Alpha 3 goes a bit too far when it comes to some specific characters though. Shoto's, namely Ryu, Ken, Sakura, and Akuma, are way more difficult than any other fighter in the game. Round 9 Vega is a major issue as well, but that only exists in certain campaigns, not all of them, and all of these pale in comparison to Bison in the final round. The major reason Shoto's are so especially dreadful is because of how their moveset is designed to be capable of doing a little bit of everything. The combination of DP, Fireball, and Tatsu leads to an incredibly difficult and at times borderline impossible challenge when combined with input reading and invincibility frames, which are both things the AI periodically gets. This forces the player to play the game inauthentically in order to succeed, which is antithetical to fighting game design and does a poor job of onboarding new players into the PvP. Likewise, Vega can be difficult for the same reason because of how he zips all over the screen, although his difficulty is dependent on how many options the player has available to them to counter his movement. Sometimes he would feel borderline impossible to defeat, whereas other times, such as when I played through the game with Rose, he would be chump change. Rose having a super good anti-air foundationally changes the mechanics of the fight. The final thing the AI does that makes it so difficult at times is how every single special move is just a single button press for them. This comes up with Zangief because of how he's able to hit his double 360 super without moving an inch. Even more so than him though is how Bison can use his Psycho Crusher super at the exact instant the player hits any button. In fact, this is something all AI can do, but it really stands out in this particular case because of how this super does damn near 70% damage. In fact, in order to see the endings, I used the save feature of the 30th anniversary collection to allow me to actually beat him in a timely manner. Otherwise, I would have needed to play Alpha 3 for several hundred more hours to do so, which is something I definitely would have been willing to do if I had the time, but I just don't. If this would have impacted my cost analysis, I wouldn't have done it, but since losing to Bison doesn't actually cost any quarters, using this feature had literally zero effect on that aspect of this video. There was one time where I beat Bison entirely legitimately with Karen, which definitely had me popping off. In the end, Alpha 3 would cost me $107.98, which is the equivalent of $212.67 today. This means that in the arcades themselves, I don't think Alpha 3 would have been worth playing all the way through with each character. But I also don't think Capcom ever expected players to. It's far more likely that players played through the campaign with a handful of their favorite characters and spent the rest of their quarters on PvP play. Fortunately, that's not a concern for the modern gamer, which means it cost nothing to be able to try out all the new characters introduced in Alpha 3. For this section, I'm actually only going to be talking about two characters, Armika and Karen, because they are the only characters new to Alpha 3. The other characters introduced in Alpha 3 that weren't in Alpha 2 are ones like Honda, which is already an established character in the franchise. As I said just a little bit ago, I had some real great success with Karen. She's kind of Sakura's kin in a lot of ways, and her color scheme and hair color make me think that this is intentional. Unlike the Ryu and Ken binary, Sakura and Karen don't play even even remotely similarly. Sakura is a Shoto, but a unique one at that, whereas Karen's primary special is a combo attack that allows the player to select how they want it to end. They can pick a leaping attack, a powerful dual elbow finisher, a pushing palm, a slide, and stuff like that. Each of these enders can also be activated outside of the special, allowing Karen to be particularly unpredictable up close. These gameplay aspects are why I enjoyed playing the character so much, which is interesting because I actually wasn't super jazzed about playing her just from the way she looks. By the end of my time with her though, I definitely began to reflect upon her character design way more positively, which just goes to show how important fun gameplay design is to how a fighting game character is received. The other new character, Mika, is chirotically intriguing. Professional wrestling was so popular in the 90s, and loads of video games were influenced by Monday Night Nitro and Raw is War. Mika herself is inspired by the manga Lucha Doll and the wrestler Cutie Suzuki. But the first thing I thought of while playing through her campaign was actually, but that's just where I went mentally while playing through her campaign for each ism. Regardless, I love Mika's moveset, and the way her super is tied to her jumping off the top ropes is just so iconic and cool. In fact, both of these characters place quite highly in my overall favorites in the game. Something I've been wanting to do with each of these Street Fighter reviews, and will likely continue to do for each fighting game review I do moving forward, is list out my favorite characters by the end of my time with the title. Alpha 3 is actually going to be the first game in the series where Ken is not my top pick. I can't really explain why, but I actually liked playing him less in this game than the other two Alpha titles. My top 5 characters in order are definitely Karen, Mika, Adon, Akuma, and Cammy. I've already talked about why Karen and Mika are so cool, but Adon being one of my favorites actually threw me for a loop because I really didn't care for this character in either of the other Alpha games. The added tools he gets in his X-ism contributes to his high placement for sure, but I also found myself liking his A-ism mode quite a bit too. Akuma lands this high primarily because of how consistently I began to be able to hit his Shungokusatsu, which just feels epic, especially when you kill Bison with it. Cammy was one of my favorite characters in Super Turbo, and so it's not really surprising that I would like her so much in Alpha 3. I'm happy to see her back in the series for sure. Finishing my second Street Fighter series of games really prompts me to ponder, to stay a second wonder, at how Capcom got to the Alpha series out of SF2. I'll be perfectly honest with you all. I like Alpha 3 way more than the SF2 series of games, and it's not even remotely close. World Warrior, Turbo, and Super Turbo are all great, no doubt, but none of them are as fun to play as Alpha 2 or 3, and I think this primarily comes down to the fact that the Alpha games pushed the super meter mechanic further, the art style and direction are more exciting, I personally find the music to sound better, and the AI is far more balanced. I moan and groan about the AI in these games, but the Alpha Trilogy is not nearly as bad as Guile and Vega in World Warrior, Blanca and Champion Edition and Turbo, or the American AI in Super Turbo. Each SF2 game has cracked AI that cheats way more often, leading to quite a bad experience at times. Alpha's AI cheats, of that there's no doubt, but it happens far less often, leading to playthroughs that are a nice blend of fair-feeling challenge, which invariably leads to an experience that feels more fun upon reflection. My data supports this idea too, as Super Turbo cost me $297.90 by the time I finished that game, and that's without finishing it with every character. And let's not forget that Alpha 3 has significantly more characters and cost over $80 worth of quarters less. Now, Super Turbo is a unique situation for sure, but both are the final game in their separate series, and both have the hardest AI for their particular series of games. The variable campaign structure of the Alpha games also makes them far more replayable in my esteem, and these factors directly impact my answer to the final question I always answer at the end of each of my reviews: will this game make my top 100 list for the decade of its release? Street Fighter Alpha 3 is most assuredly making my top 100 of the 90s, replacing Mega Man X4. However, this conclusion is a bit different from my previous ones, as it will be changing the category of Super Turbo as well. There's a near 0% chance that a Street Fighter game of some kind doesn't make my final top 100 list. However, the real question is, which one or ones will make it in the end? As such, Alpha 3 will be joining Alpha 2 in the blue category, which means they'll be up for being cut if I play a better fighting game at some point. There are 256 90s games left on my backlog, so who knows how the final version of this list is going to look. Super Turbo will also be getting downgraded from the red category, which made it safe from removal, to the blue category because I find it unlikely that I'll ever return to the game when Alpha 2 and Alpha 3 are sitting right there. This is not the end of Alpha 3 for me either, as I'm led to believe that the PS1 port, the upper revision, and the max version are all incredibly different from one another, and at some point in the future, likely after I finished my Street Fighter review series, I'd like to review those games too. Sound off in the comments below if you'd like me to review upper and the PS1 port of Alpha 3, the SNES port of Alpha 2, and Ultra Street Fighter 2 on the Switch before moving on from Street Fighter. My plan right now is to focus on the mainline releases, namely the 3 trilogy and 4 through 6. After that, I'll be getting the EX trilogy, Cross Tekken, and Fighting EX later, which isn't technically an SF game, I know, but since it shares the EX development team, I'm going to count it for the purposes of my channel. I've got no problem playing through these other versions of SF2, Alpha 2, and Alpha 3 if you all want, but that is going to extend my video lineup for Street Fighter for quite a bit, and I'd like to finish it before moving on to another long-running series. You let me know, because I'm fine either way. And with that, guys, I'm going to conclude this video by stating plainly that I find Alpha 3 to be a timeless bit of fighting game design, something I know I've been saying a lot recently in regards to the SF series. That's more a statement on just how good fighting game fans were eating back in the day though, so now let me turn it over to all of you. What do you think of Alpha 3? Let's discuss in the comments below, and while you're down there, consider smashing that like button, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. If you really liked the video, maybe you'd even do me a solid by hyping up it. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games, and I'll see y'all in the next one.